At the moment, we can post this form without any data, and that gives us back a null value when we hit that store method inside of our post controller. And that's not great. We want to make sure we validate this, first of all, for the person that's using this form so they can see if they've done anything wrong. And second of all, so we're not inserting null values potentially into our database. So if we head over to the post controller, we need to figure out at this level how we make validation so we can redirect back to the form with errors. Now, in most frameworks, that's pretty complicated. You have to set things up, flash messages, or store items in the session. With Laravel, it's incredibly easy. Now, before we dive into that, let's take a look at this base controller. So the base controller we're extending. Let's open this up, and that's within the directory just here within controllers. You can see that this is pretty bare, but it does use a few traits. And you can see here we've got authorizes request, dispatches jobs, and validates requests. Let's open that trait up. That exists within the Laravel framework, so this is under the Laravel framework's namespace. But let's come down and see what we've got. So we've got this validate method here, which takes in a request, which we already know how to grab because we're doing that here already. And it takes in an array of rules, an array of potential messages, which by default are just an empty array, and any custom attributes. We're going to look at these two here to see how we can get validation working. So because this exists within a trait on the base controller, we have access to it in any of the methods inside of our controllers. Let's just try this out. So let's go ahead and say this validate, and we know that we need to pass a request in and an array of rules. So how do we define these out? This is an array, of course, and the keys here correspond to the data you're posting through. So let's just go ahead and open up our view here. We know that this is called title. So all we need to do is pass in the key of the thing that we want to validate, and then a list of rules. These can be in an array, or they can be in a string separated by a pipe symbol. So Laravel has lots of built-in validation rules, pretty much everything that you need to get your application working. So for example, we have rules like required, and we have rules like max, where we can use a colon to specify the parameter that we want to pass into this rule. So I might say, well, a title needs to be a maximum of 20 characters, in which case I use that max rule. All of the validation rules that Laravel provides are over on the Laravel documentation. So as you're building things, you don't need to remember all of these. You just need to head over to the documentation and check out which rule suits what kind of form you're posting through to. Okay, so we've done this, but we're not doing any kind of if statement around this, or, returning a value and doing an if statement. Instead, what this will do is if the validation from the request based on the data for whichever field you're adding, you can add multiple fields in here. If this fails, it's going to throw a validation exception. And what the Laravel framework will do then is a couple of things. It will store the errors back from this inside of an error bag, which you can access within your templates, and it will redirect the user back to the page that they came from. So if this fails for any reason, we'll be redirected back to the create form with them errors. Let's go over and see this in action. So I'm going to click post, and sure enough, you can see we've been redirected back. If I fill this in properly, we are through. So it's not allowing this to happen, which is potentially storing this in the database. Instead, it's redirecting us back. So the next thing we need to do is figure out how to actually extract these errors. There are a couple of ways that you can do this, but within Blade, we have a directive which allows us to really easily access errors that we have. So typically you do this under each of the inputs that you've created. So this relates to the title. And let's go ahead and use this error directive. All we need to do here is pass through the thing that we're looking for. We need to go ahead and end the error down here, like with most things. And in here, within the scope of this, we get a message. Now, let's take a look at what this actually outputs. Let's go over and hit post. You can see we get the title field is required. Let's just go ahead and separate this out a little bit just so it looks a little bit better. Of course, we're not using any styling just at the moment. And let's just wrap the message here in a div as well, just to bring that down to a new line. So I'm going to hit post, and we see, sure enough, the title field is required. This is a default message which takes a parameter, which is the column we're looking for, the thing that we're posting, and puts it into this default error message. They can be customized, as we've already seen, by passing in a second array. So for example, if you wanted the title to have a different message, for example, please fill this in, you could do that. So that just corresponds to the thing that you're posting through. If we just post that through and we actually make sure we define the rule, so we're going to say title required. So this is the message that we want to give for this rule for this particular thing. You can see we get please fill this in. So you can customize that, but I'll let you go ahead and do that as you need. For now though, most of the validation messages are pretty clear and easy to see. So we're showing the first error here, but again, if I enter something that's greater than 20 characters, you can see the title may not be greater than 20 characters. So that will just go through the rules and it will not let us continue if that's the case. Let's go ahead and just bring in another field in here. So let's bring in a text area. So let's switch this over to a text area, end that out there, and let's get rid of the type. And let's go and say body, and let's call this body. And let's just give that an ID of body as well. Okay, so now we have another field in here that we can potentially submit. Let's go back over to our post controller and add a new validation rule for this. And again, this is pretty similar. We're just going to say required. Of course, this is pretty simple data, and maybe we have a max here of 200. So now what's going to happen is when we post this through, we get the error for both of these, which is great. So validation is incredibly simple within Laravel. Now, before we dive in any further, there's one thing that we need to figure out here, and that is if, for example, I enter a valid title, but I don't include a body, this data disappears. And once again, traditionally within frameworks, this would be really difficult to do. You'd maybe have to flash that data to a session so you could pick it up within the form when it's been redirected. But Laravel has a really helpful method in here called old. So what we can do is we can use a value attribute on an input, and we can reference the old method, which will contain old flash data from the form that you've just submitted. So we'd just say value old title. By default, that won't be filled, but if we're redirected back with an error, that will then appear in there. We can do the same thing for the text area. It's slightly different because we just put it within the tags, but it works in exactly the same way. So we just say old body. Let's come over and see the difference, and I'm going to enter a title, hit post, and there we go. That stayed in there, and we can just fill out the rest of the form and see that submitted through as we did before. Now, as well as this errors directive or error directive, we also have the ability to manipulate and display errors in slightly different ways. So for example, let's just create an if statement up here with Blade, and we're going to use this errors variable. Now, this comes through with a piece of middleware. So if we just go into our middleware kernel here and we have a look, we've got this share errors from session. What this piece of middleware will do, which is tucked away in the Laravel framework, is it will pass down to our view the errors variable, taking the errors from the session. So that's how that works behind the scenes. So we could say if errors has, for example, let's just say title, and we can end the if statement there, and we can just say fill in title, for example. Let's come over and give this create page a refresh, click post, and there we go, we get the error up there. So that's a slightly different way to access them. If, for example, you wanted to output all errors at the top, what you could do is say if errors any, then you could start to iterate through them. So you could say for each errors get or errors all as error, end the for each just there, and you could output each of them errors like so. So you could maybe create out an unordered list in here and go ahead and create a list item for each of them errors. And let's see what happens now. So let's go ahead and post this through, and you can see we get both of them errors output. So it's really up to you how you structure this, depends on how your application looks. But we know that we can access now this via the errors variable within Blade, or we can use this error directive, which is usually a bit more convenient. Now, one last thing before we go, if we look at this input, maybe we wanted to add a class to this if there was an error. So I'm just going to do this really roughly at the top of the page. It doesn't really matter too much for now because we're just playing around. But I'm going to create out a style in here called red, and I'm just going to set the color to red. So let's say that we wanted to make the text of this input red if there was an error, just as a really silly example. Well, we can actually use this error directive, or in fact an if statement inside of these. There's not really many limits to what you can do within Blade. So if, for example, I wanted to say error in here for title and then end the error on the same line, I can do that. And I can apply the red class to this input if we have an error for title. And what that allows you to do is just control things out a little bit better. In fact, let's go ahead and set the border color to red. That makes a bit more sense, and hit post. And you can see that border now goes red. So you can use these to customize any classes that need to be added to inputs. You could do the same for the text area, but I think it's worth mentioning that we can do things like this in line. And of course, you can also use an if statement in here with the errors if you wanted to, as we've already seen. Okay, let's get rid of that because that's not too useful at the moment. I'm also going to get rid of that class from there, but we've now covered pretty much the basics of validation to get you started validating forms.